"Sign it now," the attorney said, sliding the contract across the polished oak table as the digital clock on the wall flipped to 9:59 a.m., its red numbers glowing like a warning no one wanted to read. And at the head of the table, Richard Caldwell didn't hesitate, his pen already in hand, silver, heavy, custom engraved, the kind of pen that had closed billion-dollar deals and buried competitors without a second thought, while around him the room sat still in tailored suits and quiet confidence. A dozen executives watching the final seconds tick down like it was just another routine victory, another acquisition, another name absorbed into Caldwell Holdings before lunch. And no one noticed a man by the glass wall until he spoke. "Sir, that clause will destroy your company." The voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It cut through the room with a clarity that didn't belong there, and the pen stopped midair, not dropped, not shaken, just paused, as if time itself had caught its breath. And slowly, heads turned, one by one, confusion first, then irritation, then disbelief, because the man standing there wasn't part of the meeting, wasn't part of the company structure, wasn't even supposed to be visible. Marcus Reed stood with a mop still in his hand, the faint scent of industrial cleaner clinging to his uniform, his badge clipped crookedly to his chest, his shoes worn from long shifts that started when the building emptied and ended before anyone important arrived. And yet there he was, standing in a room where deals were made in minutes and mistakes cost millions, looking directly at the most powerful man in the building. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, not yet, but in something colder, something more precise, the kind of look that measured people and dismissed them in the same second. "Excuse me," someone muttered. A quiet chuckle followed, low, dismissive, like the room itself was correcting an error. Marcus didn't move, didn't step back, didn't apologize. He simply shifted his grip on the mop handle and said, "Page 17, subsection C. It reverses liability if the merger fails." The words landed heavier this time, not because of volume, but because of certainty, and that was what didn't belong. Certainty from a man in his position, a janitor, a cleaner, someone who was expected to move silently between rooms, not interrupt the decisions inside them. Richard leaned back slightly, pen still hovering above the signature line, his jaw tightening just enough to be noticed by those closest to him. "Security," he said calmly, almost casually, as if ordering coffee. "Remove him." A guard near the door stepped forward immediately, efficient, practiced, but Marcus didn't resist. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He only said one more thing, softer now, almost like it was meant for Richard alone. "If you sign that, sir, everything shifts onto you." And for a fraction of a second, something flickered in Richard's eyes. Not fear, not doubt, just a disruption, a ripple in the certainty he wore like a tailored suit. The clock clicked to 10 a.m. The room held its breath, and the pen still hadn't touched the paper. The door closed behind Marcus with a soft click that somehow felt louder than anything that had happened in the room. And for a moment, the hallway outside seemed colder, quieter, like the building itself had swallowed him back into the place where people like him were expected to stay. Invisible, replaceable, forgotten, he stood there with the mop still in his hand, the faint hum of fluorescent lights buzzing above him, and he exhaled slowly, steady, controlled, as if he had just stepped out of something far bigger than himself. Inside the boardroom, the silence stretched a second too long, then another, until one of the junior analysts shifted in his seat and cleared his throat. "Sir, we are already past the signing window." His voice careful, cautious, but Richard did not respond right away. His eyes were still on the contract, not scanning, not reading, just resting there, as if the words might rearrange themselves if he stared long enough. "It is nothing," one of the partners said, with a dismissive wave. "He does not understand what he is talking about." A few nods followed, quick, eager, the room trying to reset itself, to return to the rhythm it understood, control, authority, certainty. Richard lowered his pen slightly, but did not sign. "Page 17, he said almost under his breath. The attorney beside him hesitated for the smallest fraction of a second before flipping the pages. The soft sound of paper sliding against paper, suddenly loud in the stillness. "Subsection C," Richard added, and now there was a shift, subtle but real. The attorney leaned in closer, his eyes moving faster, his confidence tightening into focus, then slowing, then stopping, his brow creased. "It is standard language," he began, but the conviction was no longer there. Richard did not look at him. "Read it out loud," he said, calm, flat, and the request hung in the air heavier than any command. The attorney adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and read, each word precise, legal, carefully constructed, but as the sentence unfolded, something inside it twisted, the structure bending in a way that was easy to miss if you were not looking for it. A reversal hidden behind familiar phrasing, a shift of responsibility buried under layers of compliance language. And across the table, one of the analysts leaned forward, his tablet already in his hands, scrolling, cross-checking, his expression tightening with every second. "Sir," he said quietly, not to interrupt, but because he could not ignore it anymore, "if this triggers underpost merger conditions, the liability transfers entirely to us." The room changed in that moment. Not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably. Shoulders stiffened, eyes sharpened. The easy confidence dissolved into something more fragile, more cautious. Richard's grip on the pen loosened, and for the first time that morning he leaned back fully in his chair, the leather creaking softly beneath him, his gaze lifting from the contract to the glass wall where Marcus had been standing just minutes ago. Now empty, clean, as if he had never been there at all. "Who drafted this clause?" Richard asked, his voice no longer casual. The attorney hesitated, just long enough for the question to land harder than intended. "It came from their legal team, but it was reviewed," he said, and even he sounded unsure now. Richard's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in realization, the kind that settles slowly and leaves no room for denial. He looked back at the page, then at the clock, now reading. 10:02 a.m., 2 minutes past the moment everything was supposed to be finalized, and instead the room sat suspended, caught between what almost happened and what had just been revealed, and somewhere down the hallway, Marcus Reed dipped his mop back into the bucket, wrung it out with steady hands, and returned to the floor like nothing had changed at all. The room did not return to normal after that. It could not. Something too precise had cracked beneath the surface, and once seen it could not be unseen. Richard Caldwell closed the folder slowly, not with hesitation but with intention, the kind that signaled a shift in control rather than a loss of it. "This meeting is paused," he said, his voice low but final, and no one argued. No one even moved at first, because the tone had changed, the certainty was gone, replaced by something sharper, more alert. The attorney gathered his papers quickly, avoiding eye contact, while the analyst kept scrolling, verifying, double-checking, as if hoping the numbers would correct themselves. But they did not. They only confirmed what had already settled into the room like a quiet truth. Richard stood, straightened his jacket, and without another word walked toward the glass doors. The same doors Marcus had been led through just minutes earlier. The hallway outside was long, lined with polished floors that reflected the overhead lights in clean, uninterrupted lines, and at the far end, near a corner where most executives never looked twice, Marcus Reed moved the mop in steady, practice strokes, back and forth, precise, controlled, as if the rhythm itself kept his thoughts in place. He did not look up when he heard the footsteps. Not at first, because footsteps like those usually passed him by without pause. But these did not. They slowed, then stopped. And for a brief second, there was only the faint sound of water dripping from a mop head back into the bucket. Richard stood there, not speaking, just observing, taking in details he had never allowed himself to notice before. The worn edges of Marcus's gloves, the careful way he wrung out the mop to avoid leaving streaks, the quiet discipline and movements that asked for nothing and expected less. "What did you learn that?" Richard asked finally, and the question was not about the floor. Marcus paused, just slightly, then straightened, resting his hands on the handle, his expression calm, unreadable. "Learn what, sir?" he replied, his voice even, respectful but not submissive. Richard held up the contract he had brought with him, the pages slightly bent now, less perfect than before. "That clause," he said, and for a moment the hallway felt smaller, more focused, like the world had narrowed to just the two of them. Marcus glanced at the document, then back at Richard, and there was no pride in his eyes, no urgency to prove himself right, just a quiet acknowledgement. "I have seen it before," he said. "Different company, same structure." Richard studied him, waiting, and Marcus continued. "It looks like protection, but it shifts everything after the deal closes. Most people do not read that far, or they assume it is standard." There was a brief silence, not uncomfortable, just honest. "You are a janitor," Richard said, not as an insult this time, but as a statement he was trying to reconcile with what stood in front of him. Marcus nodded once. "Yes, sir." Richard's gaze did not leave him. "That is not what I asked," and something in that moment shifted again, quieter than before, but deeper. Marcus exhaled slowly, his eyes dropping for just a second before returning, steady. "I studied finance," he said. "Did not finish." Richard waited, and Marcus added, "Life does not always follow the plan." The words hung there, simple, unembellished, and for the first time that morning Richard Caldwell did not have a response ready. He looked at the man in front of him, really looked, and saw not a role, not a uniform, but a mind he had nearly ignored, and behind them the clock in the hallway ticked forward, each second carrying the weight of what almost happened in the quiet presence of the man who had seen it coming long before anyone else. Richard did not move right away, and that in itself was unusual, because men like him were always in motion, always deciding, always closing the distance between problem and solution. But now he stood still in a quiet hallway that smelled faintly of cleaning solution and polished stone, holding a contract that no longer looked like power but like something narrowly avoided. "You saw it before," he repeated, not questioning, not doubting, just turning the words over as if they carried more weight than they appeared. Marcus nodded once, his hands resting lightly on the mop handle. "Yes, sir." Richard glanced down at the page again, then back at Marcus. "And you just happened to notice it while cleaning." There was a slight edge to the question, not accusatory, but searching for something that made sense within his world. Marcus did not react to the tone. The folder was left open in the conference room earlier. He said calmly, "I was wiping the table." He paused, then added, "I read fast." Richard's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in recalibration, as if he was adjusting how he measured the man in front of him. "Most people in that room did not catch it," he said almost to himself. Marcus gave a small shrug, not dismissive, just honest. Most people in that room were not looking for it. The statement hung there, simple, direct, and for a moment Richard let out a quiet breath through his nose, something close to a restrained acknowledgement. Footsteps echoed faintly from the boardroom behind them as voices began to rise, low at first, then sharper. Analysts cross-checking numbers, attorneys re-examining language, the controlled environment unraveling into something more urgent, more human. Richard glanced back toward the sound, then returned his attention to Marcus. "If I had signed it," he said, and this time it was not a hypothetical. It was a near reality. Marcus met his gaze without hesitation. "You would have carried the liability, sir, all of it," he said. "Lawsuits, losses, everything tied to their side of the deal would become yours." Richard's jaw tightened just slightly, not from anger, but from the clarity of it, the scale of what had almost happened settling in with quiet precision. "And you still spoke up," Richard said, "knowing what room you were walking into." Marcus looked down briefly at the floor, the reflection of the overhead lights stretching across the polished surface, then back up, steady again. "It was the right thing to do," he said. Nothing more, no explanation, no attempt to impress, just a statement that did not need decoration. Richard studied him for a long second. Then another, the kind of silence that carried more than words. "Do you always do that?" he asked, and there was something different in his tone now. Less distance, more curiosity. Marcus gave the smallest hint of smile, not wide, not proud, just real, not. "Always," he said, "only when it matters." Another pause followed, softer this time, and Richard shifted his weight slightly. The contract still in his hand, no longer a symbol of control, but of something narrowly escaped. "Come with me," he said finally, turning back toward the boardroom doors, then stopping just enough to add, "I want you in that room." Marcus blinked once, not in shock, but in quiet processing, his grip on the mop loosening slightly as he glanced down at it. Then back at Richard. "Sir, I am not part of your team," he said, not refusing, just stating the obvious. Richard looked at him again. And this time there was no dismissal in his expression, no trace of the earlier distance. "You are the only one who saw the problem," he replied. "Right now. That makes you the most important person in the building." The words settled between them, unexpected, unforced, and for a moment Marcus did not move. Then slowly, deliberately, he set the mop back into the bucket, water rippling softly as the handle leaned against the edge, and without another word, he stepped forward, following Richard Caldwell back to a room that had not been built for someone like him, but was about to hear him anyway. The boardroom doors opened again, but this time the air inside was different, tighter, sharper, the easy confidence from earlier replaced by quiet urgency. Conversation stopped the moment Richard stepped in, and when Marcus followed a step behind him, the silence deepened, not out of respect, but confusion, disbelief, a few glances exchanged quickly, subtle but unmistakable, the kind that asked questions no one wanted to say out loud. Richard did not sit right away. He walked to the head of the table, placed the contract down with deliberate care, then looked across the room. "We are not signing," he said, and the statement landed heavier than any argument. One of the senior partners leaned forward immediately. "Richard, we are minutes away from closing this deal. We cannot just pause because of a misunderstanding." His tone was controlled, but the tension underneath was clear. Richard did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "It is not a misunderstanding," he replied. "It is a transfer of liability that leaves us exposed." The attorney opened his mouth to respond, but hesitated just long enough for the doubt to show. Richard turned slightly, gesturing toward Marcus without introducing him, without explanation. He saw it before any of us did. And now the attention shifted fully, not just curiosity anymore, but scrutiny, the kind that measured worth in seconds. One executive let out a quiet breath, almost a scoff. "With all due respect, we are relying on a janitor's interpretation of a multi-million-dollar contract." The words were polite, but the meaning was not. Marcus stood still, hands at his sides, not defensive, not offended, just present. Richard's expression did not change. "We are relying on facts," he said, then turned to Marcus. "Show them." The room stilled again, not frozen like before, but focused. Marcus stepped forward slowly, not rushing, not hesitating. He did not reach for the chair, did not sit. He remained standing beside the table, looking down at the open contract, subsection C, he said, his voice calm, even the same tone he used in the hallway. "It appears to limit risk, but the phrasing allows post-merger claims to bypass shared responsibility." A few executives leaned in despite themselves, their eyes following the lines he indicated. Marcus continued, "If any compliance issue surfaces after the merger, even if it originates from their side, it defaults to your company as the primary liable entity." The analyst from earlier nodded, almost instinctively, already recognizing the structure. Marcus did not speak faster, did not try to impress. He simply explained, piece by piece, until the room began to see what he had seen. Not all at once, but enough for the confidence to break, enough for the silence to return, heavier this time. One of the partners shifted in his chair. "That is not how it was presented," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. Richard watched the room carefully, not with anger, but with a kind of clarity that cut deeper. "No," he said, "it was not." Another pause settled, longer now, and no one rushed to fill it because the reality had already taken its place. The deal they had been ready to sign, the one they believed would strengthen them, had been something else entirely, something they had nearly accepted without question. And the only reason they had not was standing beside the table in a uniform that did not match the room. Marcus stepped back slightly when he finished, not waiting for acknowledgement, not expecting it. He had said what needed to be said, and for a moment no one spoke, until Richard reached forward, closed the contract firmly, and said, "We are done here." And this time, no one argued at all. Chairs shifted softly against the floor as people began to stand, but no one rushed for the door. The usual post-meeting chatter was gone, replaced by a quiet unease that lingered in the air like something unresolved. Folders were gathered more slowly, tablets closed without the usual confidence, and eyes drifted, not toward Richard, but toward Marcus, as if trying to understand how someone they had overlooked had just changed the course of a decision worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Richard remained at the head of the table for a moment longer, his hand resting lightly on the closed contract. Then he turned to his team. "I want a full audit of every clause in every pending deal," he said, his tone measured but firm. "No assumptions, no shortcuts." The attorney nodded quickly, already making notes, the earlier certainty replaced by careful precision. "Yes, sir," he replied, and the others followed with quiet agreement, one by one filing out of the room, until only a few remained. The analyst who had spoken earlier lingered, glancing at Marcus with a look that was less skeptical now, more thoughtful, almost respectful, before leaving as well. The door closed again, softer this time, and the room felt larger, quieter, as if it had exhaled. Richard finally stepped away from the table and walked toward the window, the city stretching out below in clean lines and distant motion. But his focus was not on the skyline. It was somewhere closer, more immediate. "You could have walked away," he said without turning, his voice lower now, less formal. Marcus stood near the side of the table, not moving forward, not retreating, simply present. "Yes, sir," he replied, and there was no hesitation in the answer. Richard nodded slightly, almost to himself. "Most people would have," he said, then turned back, his expression no longer guarded, but thoughtful, searching. "Why did you not?" The question settled between them, not demanding, just honest. Marcus looked down briefly at the table, the reflection of the overhead lights faint on its surface, then back up, steady as before. "Because I knew what it meant," he said, "not just for the company, but for everyone tied to it." He paused just long enough for the weight of that to register. People lose jobs, families feel it. It spreads further than the numbers on the page. Richard listened without interrupting, his posture still, attentive in a way that few had ever seen from him. Marcus continued, "I have seen. It happened before," he said quietly, and there was something different in his tone now. Not louder, not emotional, but deeper, rooted in something lived rather than studied. Someone signs something they trust, and everything changes after. The room held that truth in silence for a moment. Richard's gaze did not leave him. "And you carried that with you," he said, not as a question, but as a realization. Marcus gave a small nod. "You do not forget things like that," he replied. Another pause followed, softer this time, and Richard took a slow breath, the kind that comes when something shifts internally, not visibly, but permanently. "What are you doing working here?" he asked, and the question was no longer about position or role. It was about possibility. Marcus's expression remained calm. "Working," he said simply, not deflecting, not elaborating, just stating what was. Richard studied him for a moment longer, then glanced toward the corner of the room where a spare chair sat. Unused, he pulled it out slightly with one hand, the sound quiet against the floor, and gestured toward it, not as a command, but as an invitation. "Sit," he said, and in that single word there was a shift that did not need explanation. Marcus looked at the chair, then at Richard, and for the first time since entering the building that morning, he hesitated, not from fear, but from the weight of what that simple gesture meant. Then slowly, deliberately, he stepped forward. Marcus did not sit immediately. His hand hovered for a brief second over the back of the chair, as if confirming it was real, as if this moment was not something that would be taken back the second he accepted it. Then he lowered himself into the seat slowly, carefully, his posture straight, not relaxed, not tense, just composed, the kind of composure built over years of knowing when to speak and when to remain silent. Richard watched him, not with the distant evaluation he had used before, but with a quieter attention, the kind that asked questions without words. The room around them felt different now, no longer a place of authority pressing down from every corner, but something more level, more human. "Tell me what you would have done," Richard said, stepping closer to the table, his voice steady, direct. Marcus glanced at the closed contract, then back at Richard. "I would have rewritten the clause entirely," he said, "or walked away from the deal." Richard raised an eyebrow slightly, not in disbelief, but in interest. "You would walk away from something this size?" he asked. Marcus nodded once. "If it is built to fail, yes," he replied. "It costs more to fix a bad deal than to lose one." The words landed with a quiet weight, not dramatic, not forceful, just true. Richard moved around the table slowly, stopping across from him, his fingers resting lightly on the edge of the surface. Most people in this building would not say that, he said. Marcus gave a small shrug. Most people in this building are not the ones who deal with the aftermath, he answered. And for a moment the statement hung in the air, simple, but cutting in its clarity. Richard let out a slow breath, almost a faint smile touching the corner of his mouth. Not amusement, but recognition. You speak like someone who has been there, he said. Marcus's gaze shifted. Briefly, not away, just inward, like a memory passing through. My father signed a contract he trusted, he said, his voice still even, but softer now. He ran a small logistics company, nothing big, just trucks, deliveries, steady work. He paused, then continued. One clause shifted everything after a partnership deal. Same structure, hidden under legal language. Richard did not interrupt, did not move. Marcus went on. Within a year, he was carrying debts that were not his, legal claims that were not his. And by the time anyone realized, it was too late. The room felt quieter, heavier, like the air itself had slowed to listen. We lost the business, Marcus said, then the house. There was no bitterness in his tone, no anger, just fact, the kind that settled long ago. That is why I read everything, he added, almost as an afterthought. Richard's expression shifted slightly, not visibly dramatic, but enough to show that something had reached him. And that is why. You spoke, he said. Marcus nodded once. Yes, sir. Another silence followed, but this one was different, not tense, not uncertain, just full. Richard straightened slightly, his hand leaving the table. Do not call me sir, he said after a moment. The words quiet, but intentional. Marcus looked at him, not confused, just acknowledging the change. Richard met his gaze directly. Not in here, he added, and for a second, something almost unspoken passed between them. Not equality, not yet, but a step toward it. Marcus gave a small nod. All right, he said, the word simple, but carrying a shift of its own. Richard glanced at the contract once more, then back at Marcus. We're going to rebuild this deal, he said, line by line. And this time when he spoke, it was not a command given from above. It was something closer to an invitation, something shared, and Marcus did not hesitate. He leaned forward slightly, his focus returning to the document, ready, not as a janitor stepping out of place, but as someone who had always belonged in the conversation, even if no one had seen it until now. The contract lay open again between them, but it no longer felt like a trap hidden in plain sight. It felt like something exposed, something that could be understood, dismantled, and rebuilt. Marcus leaned slightly forward, his eyes scanning the lines with quiet precision, not rushing, not skipping, each word passing through him as if it had weight. Richard stood across from him, not interrupting, not directing, just watching the process unfold in a way he had never allowed before. The room remained still, the city beyond the glass walls continuing its distant motion. But inside, time seemed to slow into something more deliberate. Start with the liabilities section, Richard said after a moment, his voice lower now, measured. Marcus nodded, his finger tracing lightly along the margin. This needs to be symmetrical, he said, shared responsibility, clearly defined triggers, no vague language. He glanced up briefly. If it can be interpreted two ways, it will be used the wrong way. Richard gave a small nod, absorbing it, not challenging it. What else? He asked, and the question was simple, but it carried something new, trust not fully formed, but beginning. Marcus shifted slightly in his chair, turning a page with care. The exit conditions, he said, they're written to protect them. Not you, he tapped the section lightly. You need a clean withdrawal option if compliance flags anything post-signing. Richard moved closer to the table, his attention narrowing to the document. Write it, he said, without hesitation, and Marcus paused for just a fraction of a second. Not because he did not know how, but because of what the request meant. Then he reached for a pen left near the folder, not the engraved one Richard had used earlier, just a standard pen, simple, functional, and he began to write, his movement steady, deliberate, as if he had done this 100 times before. The ink flowed across the page, restructuring, clarifying, removing ambiguity line by line. Richard watched closely, not correcting, not guiding, just observing the clarity of thought translated into language. That is cleaner, Richard said quietly after a moment. Marcus did not look up. Cleaner means harder to manipulate, he replied, finishing the sentence before moving to the next section. Minutes passed without either of them noticing. The silence no longer heavy, but focused, purposeful, the kind that exists when something is being built rather than avoided. A knock came at the door, soft but urgent. Richard glanced up. "Come in," he said. The attorney stepped inside cautiously, stopping when he saw Marcus seated at the table, pen in hand, the scene not matching anything he expected. "Sir, the opposing team is asking for an update," he said, his voice careful. Richard did not take his eyes off the document. "Tell them we are revising the terms," he replied. "We will not proceed until the structure reflects shared risk." The attorney hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, sir," and stepped back out, closing the door quietly behind him. Marcus finished the last line he was working on, then leaned back slightly, placing the pen down with the same care he had used to pick it up. "That removes the immediate risk," he said, "but you will still need a full review before signing anything." Richard looked at the revised page, then at Marcus, and for a moment there was no distinction between who owned the room and who had been invited into it. Just two people looking at the same problem from the same side. "You should have been in this room from the beginning," Richard said, not as praise, not as regret, but as a simple acknowledgement of what was now obvious. Marcus shook his head slightly. "I was where I needed to be," he replied, his voice calm, and the words settled into the space between them. Quiet, grounded, undeniable. Richard held his gaze for a second longer, then looked back down at the contract, and for the first time that morning, the path forward did not feel like a risk. It felt like a decision made with clear eyes. The room did not feel like a boardroom anymore, not in the way it had that morning. The sharp edges of authority had softened into something more deliberate, more aware, and the contract that once carried quiet danger now held lines rewritten with clarity, Marcus's handwriting steady across the margins, precise without hesitation. Richard remained standing beside him, his attention fixed not on the power of the deal, but on the integrity of it. And for a moment neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing left to say, but because the silence itself had become part of the process, a space where decisions were no longer rushed. A faint vibration broke through as Richard's phone lit up on the table, the screen displaying the name of the opposing firm. The call waiting, persistent, expecting control. Richard glanced at it, then pressed it silent without answering. The choice simple, intentional, Marcus noticed, but did not comment. Instead, he reached for the page again, scanning one last section. "There is one more thing," he said quietly. Richard looked over the enforcement clause. Marcus added, tapping lightly near the bottom, "It allows them to delay compliance while still holding you accountable." Richard's eyes narrowed slightly. "Focusing, fix it," he said, and Marcus did, adding a few lines, not long, not complex, but enough to remove the imbalance, enough to close the gap that could be exploited later. When he finished, he set the pen down again, the sound soft against the table. "Now, it is balanced," he said. Richard studied the page, reading slowly, not skimming, not assuming, each line considered, and when he finished he nodded once, a small movement, but it carried more weight than any approval spoken aloud. "Call them back," he said, and this time when the phone rang again, he answered, placing it on speaker. The voice on the other end came through confident, controlled, expecting the deal to proceed. "Richard, I assume we are ready to finalize," the man said, and for a brief second the old rhythm of power returned, familiar, practiced, but it did not hold. Richard glanced once at Marcus, then back at the contract. "We are ready to renegotiate," he replied, his tone calm, but firm, the shift immediate, the voice on the other end paused just long enough to register the change. "Renegotiate," the man repeated. "We agreed on terms." Richard did not raise his voice. "You presented terms," he said. "We are presenting corrected ones." The silence that followed was different now. Not the silence of control, but the silence of recalculation. Marcus remained still, listening, not involved in the conversation, but present in its outcome. The man on the phone spoke again, slower this time. "Send the revisions," he said, and the confidence was still there, but thinner now, less certain. Richard ended the call without another word, then looked at Marcus. "They will push back," he said. Marcus nodded slightly. They always do, he replied. But now they cannot hide anything. Another quiet settled over the room, but this one carried something new, not tension, not uncertainty, but a quiet alignment. The kind that forms when truth replaces assumption. Richard picked up the contract again, the revised. Page is no longer something he had to question, but something he understood, and for the first time since the morning began, the decision ahead did not feel like a risk. It felt like control regained, not through power, but through clarity. He placed the document back on the table and looked at Marcus, not as someone out of place, but as someone who had shifted the entire direction of the day. And in that moment, the distance between them was no longer defined by title or position, but by something far simpler. One had been willing to listen, and the other had chosen to speak. The revised contract remained open on the table, its pages no longer pristine, but marked with ink that carried intention instead of assumption. And yet the room did not settle into comfort. Something else had entered, something less visible, but more pressing. Richard's phone lit up again, not with a call this time, but with a stream of messages, rapid, insistent, the kind that signaled movement on the other side. He glanced down briefly, then handed the phone across the table toward Marcus. Without explanation, a gesture that would have been unthinkable an hour earlier. Marcus hesitated for only a second before taking it, his eyes scanning the screen quickly. The messages were short, direct, legal language stripped down into urgency. Delays questioned, pressure applied, subtle attempts to regain control through timing rather than terms. Marcus handed the phone back calmly. "They're trying to rush you again," he said. Richard nodded slightly, already aware, but hearing it confirmed carried a different weight. "They want the original timeline," Richard replied, his voice steady. Marcus leaned back slightly in the chair, his hands resting lightly on the table. "Then they need it more than you do," he said. And the statement shifted the perspective in a way that did not need emphasis. Richard's gaze sharpened, not in aggression, but in recognition. "Explain," he said. Marcus glanced at the contract, then back at Richard. If the deal was as strong as they presented, they would not push for speed over clarity, he said. They would give you time to review, because the terms would hold under scrutiny. He paused briefly, then added, "Pressure is not confidence. It is a signal." The words settled into the room with quiet precision. Richard exhaled slowly, the tension that had built earlier reshaping into something more controlled, more intentional. "So they need this signed quickly," he said. Marcus nodded once. "Before anyone looks too closely," he replied. Another silence followed, but this one was different again, not uncertain, not heavy, but focused like a line had been drawn that could not be ignored. Richard walked toward the window, looking out at the city below, the movement of people and cars distant, constant, unaffected by what had nearly happened inside this room. "I built everything by moving. Fast," he said after a moment, not turning, not addressing Marcus directly, but speaking into the space between them. "Decisions, deals, growth." He paused, then added, "Speed was always an advantage." Marcus did not interrupt, did not agree. He simply listened. Richard turned back slowly, his expression thoughtful, recalibrated. "But speed almost cost me everything today," he said, and there was no denial in it, no attempt to soften the truth. Marcus met his gaze, steady as before. "Speed is only an advantage when you're moving in the right direction," he said. "Otherwise, it just gets you there faster." The words did not need emphasis. They landed exactly where they needed to. Richard gave a small nod, almost a quiet acknowledgement of something learned rather than taught. He walked back to the table, placing both hands lightly on its surface, grounding himself in the moment. "We are not moving fast anymore," he said, not as a reaction, but as a decision. Then he looked at Marcus directly, without distance, not on anything that matters. The room held that shift in silence. And for the first time, the power in it did not come from urgency or pressure, but from restraint, from choosing to see clearly instead of quickly. And Marcus, still seated at the table, did not respond with words. He simply gave a small nod, the kind that carried understanding without needing agreement, because in that moment, both of them were no longer reacting to what had almost happened. They were deciding what would happen next. The room settled into a quiet that no longer felt uncertain. but intentional, like every sound now had space to exist without urgency pressing it forward. Richard stood at the table with the revised contract in front of him, but his attention was no longer fixed on the pages. It had shifted, not to the deal, not to the numbers, but to the man sitting across from him. Marcus remained still, his posture unchanged, calm, composed, as if nothing about the moment required him to claim it. And that, in itself, carried a weight Richard had not expected. "You could have said nothing," Richard said after a long pause, his voice lower now, less guarded than it had ever been in that room. Marcus did not look surprised by the statement. He had already answered it in different ways, but this time the question felt different, more personal. "Yes," he said simply. Richard nodded once, taking that in, then added, "And everything would have gone through." Marcus glanced briefly at the contract then, back at Richard. "Yes," he repeated, and the word did not carry blame. It carried truth. Richard exhaled slowly, his gaze dropping for a moment to the table before lifting again. "I have built my life on control," he said, not as a declaration, but as a realization forming in real time, knowing every angle, every risk, every outcome. He paused, then looked at Marcus directly. "And today, I almost missed the one thing that mattered most." The admission hung in the air, unpolished, unprotected. Marcus did not interrupt, did not soften it. He simply met the moment with the same steady presence he had held all morning. "It happens," he said quietly, "when people stop looking at what is in front of them and start trusting what they expect to see." Richard gave a faint, almost reflective nod, the kind that comes when something aligns internally. "I expected the deal to be clean," he said, "so I saw it that way." Marcus leaned back slightly, his hand still resting on the table. "Expectation is not the same as truth," he replied, the words simple but grounded. Richard let out a quiet breath that almost resembled a short laugh. Not from humor, but from recognition. "No, it is not," he said. Another silence followed, but this one carried something warmer, something closer to understanding than tension. Richard moved slowly around the table, stopping beside the chair Marcus sat in. Not above him, not behind him, just beside, equal in space if not in position. "You changed the outcome of this entire deal," he said, not as praise, not as exaggeration, but as a fact. Marcus shook his head slightly. "The outcome was already there," he said. "I just pointed to it." Richard looked at him for a moment longer, then nodded, accepting that perspective without needing to reshape it. "Still," he said quietly, "you chose to speak." Marcus met his gaze again, steady, unwavering. "I chose to do what was right," he said, and there was no emphasis in it, no attempt to elevate the moment, just a statement that stood on its own. Richard straightened slightly, his shoulders settling into a posture that no longer carried the same rigid control as before. "Most people would not," he said. Marcus did not respond immediately. Then after a brief pause, "Most people are taught not to," he said, and the room absorbed that in silence, the layers of it settling deeper than anything spoken before. Richard looked back at the contract, then at Marcus, and for the first time, the difference between them did not feel like distance. It felt like perspective, one shaped by power, the other by experience. And somewhere between those two, something had shifted into alignment, not perfectly, not completely, but enough to change what came next. Richard remained standing beside Marcus, but the distance between them had changed in a way that could not be measured in feet or titles. It was quieter than that, something internal, something that reshaped how the room itself seemed to hold them. The contract still rested open on the table, but it no longer commanded attention. It had already served its purpose, and now what remained was something less tangible, but more lasting. Richard glanced toward the door for a brief moment, as if aware of the world outside continuing its rhythm. Meetings resuming, calls waiting, expectations lining up as they always did. Then he looked back at Marcus, his expression no longer carrying the sharp edges of authority, but something steadier, more grounded. "You said your father lost everything because of a clause like this," he said, not probing, just returning to something that had not fully left the room. Marcus nodded once, his posture unchanged. "Yes," he replied. Richard studied him for a second, then asked, "Did anyone warn him?" The question was simple, but it carried weight. Marcus's gaze shifted briefly, not away, but inward, as if passing through something remembered. "No," he said. Everyone assumed someone else had checked. The words settled quietly, and Richard exhaled through his nose, a subtle release of something unspoken. "That is how it happens," he said, almost to himself. Marcus gave a small nod. "That is how it always happens," he replied. The room held that truth for a moment. Not as something new, but as something finally seen clearly. Richard moved back toward the head of the table slowly, his hand brushing lightly against the edge as he passed. Then he stopped, turning again to face Marcus. "You're not going back to cleaning floors today," he said, and the statement was not framed as an offer or a question. It was direct, but not forceful. Marcus looked at him, calm as ever. "I have a shift," he said simply, and there was no resistance in it, just reality. Richard gave a faint, almost reflective smile. "You also have a skill set this company nearly ignored," he replied. "That is not happening again." Marcus did not respond immediately, his eyes moving briefly to the contract, then back to Richard. "I did not do this for a position," he said, his voice steady, and there was no doubt in it. Richard nodded once, acknowledging the truth of that without trying to reshape it. "I know," he said. "That is exactly why I am saying it." Another quiet settled, but this one carried something warmer, something closer to respect than recognition. Richard stepped closer again, not closing distance, but meeting it. "Stay," he said, the words simple, unembellished. "Work with my team, review contracts, question what others overlook." Marcus considered the words, not with hesitation, but with care, the kind that does not rush decisions just because they are offered. "And what happens when I see something people do not want to hear?" he asked. And the question was not challenging, it was honest, grounded in everything that had brought them to this moment. Richard met his gaze without flinching. "Then you say it anyway," he replied. And this time they listened. The words did not carry force, they carried commitment. And for a moment neither of them moved. The room holding that exchange in quiet clarity, Marcus let out a slow breath. Not heavy, not uncertain, just measured, then gave a small nod. "All right," he said. And the agreement was not loud, but it carried weight, the kind that does not need repetition. Richard returned the nod, just as small, just as steady, and for the first time that day, the shift between them felt complete enough to move forward. Not perfectly, not without difference, but with something that had not existed before, recognition, not a position, but a value. And as the light from the windows reflected softly across the table, catching the edges of the rewritten pages, the room no longer felt like a place where one voice decided everything. It felt like a place where the right voice, finally heard, could change it. The room grew quiet in a way that no longer felt heavy, but settled, like something important had found its place without needing to announce it. The contract remained on the table, its pages marked not by authority, but by clarity, and the light from the floor to ceiling windows stretched across the polished surface, catching the ink where Marcus had rewritten what others had overlooked. Richard stood still for a moment longer, his gaze resting not on the skyline beyond the glass, but on the reflection of the room itself, the chair Marcus had taken, the space where voices had shifted, the place where something subtle but lasting had changed. "We start with this one," Richard said quietly, his voice no longer carrying the edge of command, but something steadier. "Then we review everything." Marcus nodded once, not as agreement to authority, but as alignment with purpose, line by line. He replied, the words simple, but grounded. In the same quiet certainty he had carried all morning, Richard gave a faint nod in return, then reached for the contract, not to sign it, but to close it with intention, the sound soft, final, not an ending, but a transition. He placed it neatly to the side, clearing the space in front of them, and for a moment neither of them moved, not because there was nothing left to do, but because the moment itself did not need to be rushed forward. The world outside continued, distant traffic moving through the city grid, sunlight shifting slightly against the glass. But inside, the pace had changed, the urgency replaced by something more deliberate, more aware. Marcus stood slowly from the chair, his movements calm. Unhurried, he glanced once at the table, then toward the door, as if remembering where he had been before all of this began. The hallway, the bucket, the quiet rhythm of work that did not draw attention. Richard noticed. Not the motion, but the meaning behind it. You are not invisible here, he said, the words quiet but clear. Marcus paused for a fraction of a second, then looked back at him, his expression unchanged but his eyes steady. I never was, he replied. Not as a challenge, not as a correction, just a truth stated without weight. Richard held that for a moment, then gave a small nod, the kind that acknowledged more than it explained. I see that now, he said, and there was no need to add anything more. The shift had already happened, not in words, but in how they stood in the same space. Marcus turned toward the door again, not leaving, just moving forward, and Richard walked beside him, not ahead, not behind, just beside. The hallway outside was the same as before, clean floors reflecting overhead light, the faint scent of disinfectant still present. But something about it felt different, not because the building had changed, but because the way it was seen had. As they reached the corner, Marcus's mop still rested against the bucket where he had left it, water settled, undisturbed, a quiet reminder of where the day had started. Richard glanced at it briefly, then back at Marcus, and without a word, he reached out, straightened the handle so it would not slip, a small gesture, almost unnoticed, but intentional. Marcus saw it, and, for the first time, a faint smile touched his expression, not wide, not dramatic, just there, present like a moment that did not need to be held on in matter. They stood there for a second, the hallway quiet around them. And then Marcus reached for the handle, not because he had to, but because it was still part of who he was, and Richard did not stop him, did not change it. He simply stood there, understanding something he had not understood before. That value did not come from where someone stood, but from what they chose to see. And as Marcus moved the mop forward, the water gliding smoothly across the floor, catching the light in a clean, steady reflection, Richard remained where he was, watching not the action, but the meaning behind it. And in that quiet, ordinary motion, something stayed with him, something that did not need to be spoken, because it had already been learned, not in the boardroom, not in the contract, but in the moment he finally chose to listen.